been through summer. Boa noite. Welcome everyone. Welcome everyone. Hi, good evening. It's a pleasure to have everyone here. I want to thank Pipedrive for receiving us so well. Danielle for having so much patience with our setup here. We are live streaming on YouTube. So if you have a friend that couldn't come today, couldn't join us today, you can share the URL with them. It's lisbonux.org/live. So it's live now. The topic today is really interesting, and I'm happy to see that we have full house. I can see that we have a diverse audience as well, and we have great speakers. We have Inês and Vanessa from Pipedrive. They're going to talk to us about inclusion and remote work as well. We have James Tattersfield from Polar Insight. And then we have Farai Madzima from Shopify from Canada. He came all the way from Canada to speak in Lisbon. And we have the luck of having him today. So before coming here, I opened my phone. I was in the metro. The metro, by the way, nowadays, I think, is the most diverse place to be in Lisbon. You go in, there's people from every country, and everyone is in one direction. And I was checking my phone, and I went to Público, the newspaper, and I searched for diversity, diversidade in Portuguese. And there was a few articles, biodiversity, cultural diversity, religious diversity, diversity in fashion. Gucci apparently is worried about diversity nowadays. Diversity in food, so different diets. I didn't see anything about diversity in design, which is great because that's why we are here today. So let's start this thing. I want to welcome Inês and Vanessa from Pipedrive. Round of applause for them.
So, hello everyone, welcome to Pipedrive. I would like to start by thanking Lisbon UX for hosting it with Pipedrive. I'm just going to give a piece of information, sorry, but a few people have asked me where the bathroom is. It's outside the office, if you need it. But yeah, so welcome to Pipedrive. So my name is Inês. I work at Pipedrive for already 2 years. My background is actually not in product. I've been doing web for 10 years before switching to product, and it's been a very good journey. And I'll pass it on to Vanessa.
Okay. So, hi everyone, my name is Vanessa, and I've been working at Pipedrive for around 7 months. And I already had the opportunity to work in 2 big features, which allowed me to be in touch with so many different people and teams. Well, today we'll be talking about diversity, but to that in a while. Before, I will introduce you to what actually is Pipedrive, because some of you may not know. Here is a quick introduction video. It's around 1 minute.
Pipedrive is a complete sales CRM platform designed by experienced salespeople. It's the perfect way to visually display your team's sales processes and automate the essential but repetitive tasks you need to accomplish. You can track your team's performance using customizable KPIs which match the industry you operate in. By making Pipedrive your weapon of choice, your team will smash targets with ease by breaking down strategic goals into small, everyday tasks. The interface is visually intuitive and highly organized, which is why sales teams around the globe love using it. Because Pipedrive gives you focus and shows you what deals need your attention the moment you log in, no matter where you are. You can integrate your existing tools and processes, customizing it to your business. As a complete CRM platform, Pipedrive will automatically sync your emails and log your calls, keeping everything you need to know about a prospect in one neat place. So now you can stay focused, save time, and close more deals. Selling has become beautiful again. This is Pipedrive. We make salespeople unstoppable.
So, in a nutshell, this is Pipedrive. We make salespeople unstoppable. We are a CRM, and the idea is to make salespeople more efficient. It actually has been founded in 2010 in Estonia by 5 guys, and they have been in Lisbon for 2 years now. We reached 100 people here in Lisbon, but in total we reached the mark of 500, and we're working for around 80,000 customers. And in a nutshell, this is Pipedrive. Hope you have now a better understanding of what we do. And we are going to talk to you about diverse teams and the challenge of inclusion. We're going to focus on the design team and try to provide you an overview of our challenges and what we have been doing to overcome them. So in order to do that, let's just try to understand what is diversity, what do we feel, and what is diversity as a mental model for us nowadays. So it would be useful to go back and try to understand how we got to where we are now. So if we go back to the Latin term, the origin of the word, divertere, was actually, it meant to turn in different directions. And with the evolution of our ways of doing and being, it actually started to be and to have a wider scope. And it touched points such as variety and uniqueness until it got us to what we are today. So how do we feel and perceive diversity as of currently? It is actually the fact of many different types of things or people being included in something. So we came from this separatedness, from going in different directions, to variety and uniqueness, until this much more inclusion of parts in a bigger thing. So it actually, this concept came closer to the concept of inclusion. But how does this mean something for us as designers? Not only are we designing for a complex and diverse world, we are also designing within diverse teams. We are doing this job of building richer products. How can we make all of these people, how can we enable them to contribute with all that they have, all of their differences, in order to build a richer product, something that is built with all of those parts? Are we actually building a world where diversity is inclusion? Are we aware of the fact that so many different people can contribute positively to the creation of a richer product? So here at Pipedrive, as I told you before, we are 500, and we are spread across 6 different locations. So this is pretty diverse. And this is our design team. We are 22 people. And from here, from this image, you can see that we have some differences, just from this picture, without missing anything to you. How can we make them build something together that's not, it actually means trouble to you?
Thanks. Okay. So, yeah, so Vanessa was describing diversity and what that translates into the inclusion. So are we including people? So there might be some obstacles or things that contribute to not being included in the team. Sorry. So yeah, as you were saying, so we are spread across locations. So obviously being apart, it's part of the complicated bit. And I'm going to talk about a few more. So yeah, cross locations, lack of visibility of trust. What does that mean? I think if you're working with someone face to face, as I work with Vanessa, so I know what she's capable of, I know her capabilities, and automatically I know her, so I have more trust. So yeah, so the scheduling can also be difficult because of the time zone. So we're more spread apart, so it makes it difficult to include everyone into the process in every meeting. So that's an example of the cross-location challenge. We also have the cultural and language barriers. And that, to me, is nothing more than just acknowledging that people communicate in a different way. They perceive information in a way, and they communicate it back in a different way. So as long as we know that, it's a start and it's okay. So it's about the body language and beliefs and values. So we all heard the stereotypes, and we know that we've heard that Japanese like harmony, as the Southern European are warm, and we use our body language a lot, and the Northern European like to work with facts. And we experience that. So we have to respect it and acknowledge that. Obviously, the digital communication involved in our technology world doesn't help, so there might be more misunderstandings, and just because people don't use emojis a lot doesn't mean they're not happy or they don't care, so we communicate in different ways. Obviously, personalities, introverts, extroverts. Introverts talk normally less, and extroverts tend to over talk a little bit, and it's sometimes too hard to jump in, and I can relate because I am an introvert. So inclusion. How can we make sure that we're involving everyone in the same way or making the best out of everyone's strengths and weaknesses? Well, when I think about inclusion, I have to think of maybe examples when I felt excluded. And it's not a Pipedrive, but I do have an example. And it could be as easy as I wasn't invited to a party, but I'm going to go a little bit deeper. So well, I studied in the UK, and then I got my first job there as a designer. And I worked on this app, and it went pretty well. And I designed it, the developer built it, and it was for a transportation app with lifetime for buses, etc. So the Post wanted to write about, the local Post wanted to write about it and to take a picture and to have an interview with us. And to my surprise, everyone in my company got the picture, was in the local newspaper, and I wasn't invited. So I worked on it, and it made me think, why? And it made me feel sad, excluded, and made me think, is it because I'm Portuguese? Is it because my English is not good enough? So sometimes, not only in the workplace, of course, but these situations happen. So we just want to make sure that we empower inclusion through process and communication, and in this case specifically for designers, and across all these different locations. So I'm going to start with the feedback and critiques, which should be a thing that we're all doing right now if you're a designer. And if you're not doing it, get a process in place of doing so. So I'm going to get an overview of the iterations that we had on it because we were being excluded, we're not happy with it. So we started with putting them in place, and we were separated by locations. As you can see, we had our ones on Friday, but that wasn't working very well because you weren't including everyone, right? And it was a silo, basically. So we moved on, and we decided to have one on Mondays and one on Fridays. Again, we were 20 designers in different places and trying to communicate. And sometimes what happened was you didn't communicate. You didn't have the time to communicate because you don't know how to talk with them because you're still absorbing the culture, absorbing them, and trying to adapt and trying to relate to them. So, oh yeah, and in this format, we had two buddies. So what does that mean? If I'm going to present my work, I first have two buddies, designers, that are aware of my work, and they get the priority to talk first in the review. Okay. And it was time box, but this didn't work, and it wasn't working. We weren't happy, so we had the critique of the critique, or critique the critique. We shared our thoughts, and this is important because everyone gets to be heard. And then we iterated on it, and nowadays we have this format with anti-peers. What does that mean? That means that it's a mix between local with other locations. If we went for the, sorry, I actually meant the half peers. So yeah, but we do a 1.5 hour weekly, and it's a smaller group. There is still, so we're about 6 different locations, different backgrounds, etc. Sometimes it's still hard to hear everyone and to make the people who are more quiet to be heard and to have a voice. So a moderator might help in these cases. So some groups have moderators, but I have doubts about that because I don't know. I think if you, but it's a good idea because you can always follow up afterwards on Slack if you didn't have the time to say everything you wanted. But in these cases, might help. Other initiatives to include more people, work together. So the critique is one thing. Another type of initiatives, maybe you need the budget to do these things, but we have one thing called Moonshot. So we get together, in this case it was in Tallinn, and we put the groups with people that normally don't work together, and we were involving everyone. And we were developing new features, having new ideas. But before we went there, we actually involved the departments and other roles as well. So we asked support, sales, the product team, hey, do you have any ideas for us to bring? And we're going to try and develop them and brainstorm. And we have 2 days of activities. Don't forget to socialize. You get to know people's strengths. You get to know their culture. We didn't know that Estonians liked sauna a lot. But yeah, prior to projects or afterwards, just get there and get to know them. If you are working with other locations, one of the things is virtual coffee breaks. So instead of having a coffee in the kitchen, arrange a Zoom call, get into a room, and just have a coffee together. In our case, it turned into awkward Fridays because it was a bit awkward. We ended up talking about roadkill toys, and we started calling awkward Fridays. Yeah, more social events, the normal get-togethers, a beer after work. Oh, sorry. The Christmas, yeah. And do this every day. So just learn how to relate to each other and get to know the other strengths and weaknesses. Analyze, learn, because it's going to be a better product this way if you use and include everyone in the process.
So just to wrap up, if I don't fall. As Inês was saying, we do have these initiatives, but we also have a strong hiring process, which in the beginning tries to match our values as persons, people, with the company values. And that makes a lot of difference because we're always talking about culture and company cultures. And this is actually a thing that allows us to be working together and to respect each other. Not just, of course, we are all people. And if we get to the other side, we are building bridges. And we are actually, as cheesy as this may sound, sharing something together. So get out there, get to know your peers, and make sure that you are actually making diversity into inclusion. So thank you, guys.
Thank you, Inês. Thank you, Vanessa. Next up, we have James Tattersfield. James is a managing director at Polar Insights. Polar Insights, they do service innovation, and they have a network of researchers, global network of researchers. They also recently released something that might be interesting for all of us. It's a public report on flexible working in Portugal. It's a 51-page, I just checked. It's freely available on their website. So check it out. Flexible working nowadays, it's a very common topic. It's interesting to read. James is getting prepared.
Weird theatre show.
So, are you ready?
Yeah. Is there a clicker?
There is, yes, it's there. Let's welcome James.
Okay, so being born, going to school, taking your first driving lesson and then doing your driving test, getting married, starting a business, traveling around the world, buying your first house, raising a family, growing old with the person that you love, and dying. Government is involved in almost every significant moment of your life in some way or another, and it usually involves like a form, a application, waiting in line, blah, 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 blah. Lots of interaction with government. It's an incredibly important part of our lives that is very often neglected for some of the, I don't know, sexier bits of our life, let's say. And it kind of plays these two roles. So it plays one as a governing body, so looking after us, setting the rules, setting the laws, that kind of thing. And secondly, it acts as a service provider to us. We all know this, but we don't often think about it. It's really, really embedded in basically every single thing that we do. Unfortunately, many of the laws that govern us and the services that we use aren't designed in collaboration with the citizens that they impact or that they affect. And this is a really big problem, and I'll just show you kind of like a few of the reasons why that's a problem. This is one that's very recent, which you'll all have seen probably in the news last week. But this, for example, in Alabama in the States, was the group of lawmakers who decided on the new abortion laws within Alabama, which is just kind of crazy because it was a group of, one, all men deciding on an issue that basically only impacts women and their bodies. It was also an all-white group of men, which there's basically just no need for that, really. Like, they definitely could have found more people to be part of this community. That would be my initial thing. And that happens all over the world, all the time. We all know this. We all see it in the news time and time again. And it's a problem because it means that laws are being created not by the people who those laws are then impacting. And that's inevitably just a bad problem. We also find that there are things like this happening in kind of our daily lives. So I don't know whether everyone can see this, but things like regular services, which for a normally abled person, you might just step onto the train, but if there's a gap between the platform and the train and you're less abled, then you're going to see that as a massive, massive, something which is basically going to act negatively towards you interacting with that service. So it's not only that it's difficult, it might mean that you don't then end up using that service again. So you're coming to a service and then basically going, essentially this isn't built for me, so you never come back. And I think it's important to think about some of these things in relation to, like we're talking about government services here, I think it is very applicable to lots of other services that are created as well. This is kind of what's happening. This is a bit of an unnecessarily complicated diagram, but essentially it's basically kind of where exclusion occurs within an interaction with a service. So it's basically when the demands of the service or the product on the left-hand side exceed the capabilities of the person on the left-hand side. I think I got that wrong just then. But yeah, so basically we're kind of looking at this area here and trying to prevent that as much as possible. And there are a few ways that capabilities vary. So these are, if we think about like the different senses that people have in terms of touching stuff, seeing stuff, hearing stuff, and speaking, there's obviously kind of a permanent loss of capability that some people have. And that could be like having one arm or being blind or not being able to speak. Those are kind of permanent things which exclude you from a service. But there's also temporary capabilities. So things like if your arm's broken, you can't interact with that service when your arm's broken, but then it might heal again, so you might be able to interact with it in the future. Speaking, for example, if you were designing a service for people with throat problems, you might be doing that. If people had laryngitis, they can't speak to that service or with that service normally here, but then they operate in an environment where they can't hear. So I'm going to get through this presentation very quickly, by the way, so if anyone's got any questions as we go along, then feel free to ask. The number one thing for designing for inclusion is stop guessing about how people interact with a service or with a product and go out and ask them, because that's by far the best way to find out what people are doing when they're interacting with your service and how they think about their service. And we basically worked on a program that was focused on migration into the UK and migration across Europe. And a lot of the laws in the UK are being developed, well, not really the laws, but the services that are delivered according to the laws that are being put in place are delivered in this kind of context. So it's the civil service, people sat in Westminster, sat in government buildings being like, right, how can we figure out how to create a system that enables new people who have just arrived in the UK? How can we kind of build systems that meet their needs? And basically everyone's looking around being like, I don't even know what language they speak, or like, I don't know where they've come from, I don't know. Like, there's just so many very, very basic questions which are being asked about services like this, which are really, really important for a huge number of different reasons. So one of the things that Polar Insight does is we basically work in these contexts to try and connect people like this with the users of these different services. So this is something that we did last year, which was basically a focus group with, we were focusing on the asylum process within the UK, and we basically recruited about 50 different asylum seekers within the UK to get a sense of basically what their interactions were with the UK at different periods when they were either arriving in the UK, or one thing which we found was quite common was, so a lot of people make the journey to the UK from a war-torn country, for example. So Syria at the moment is a big kind of focus for the UK around this. And one thing there was that actually there's a lot of people from Syria already living in the UK who, when the civil war broke out, whenever that was, 10 years ago-ish, maybe a little bit less, there was lots of people living in the UK who then wanted to claim asylum. So they basically became refugees, but they were already living within communities in the UK and already had access to lots of different government services. So this was something which the perception within this particular scenario was that everyone interacting with this service had just arrived in the country, so needed to know, they needed very basic knowledge about where to go and who to talk to. Actually, a huge percentage of people knew the country, knew who to interact with, knew where to go, knew where to access support. So actually, for that group of people, you could offer a service that was relatively light or simple for them. And what that meant is that by basically splitting out that group into lots of different smaller groups, you could then find the people who needed a lot more of an intense level of service. So you could do things like make sure that you had translators there, make sure that you had support, emotional support. Lots of these people have things like PTSD, kind of post-traumatic stress disorder from these journeys. So basically what this process did was, by involving people who are going through this process, it then meant that that service was kind of redesigned and rejigged to enable them to achieve kind of better outcomes, basically. Another one that we've learned over the last few years of doing this is it's much better to design with the hardest to reach first and then work backwards. So basically go to the communities that you feel basically that you know nothing about as a designer, which I think there's just a general layer of honesty that needs to be put into design very often, which is basically we don't know who we're designing for a lot of the time. We might have some idea, but it's really, really important to try and this is very difficult, and I think that one of the talks later will be speaking more about bias, for example, but if you can try and learn more about your own biases to then know who you might be excluding, it's really good to go and design with them and then work back to people who are more within your sphere of, I don't know, your life or people that you know. We did this with, so this was a local council in London, like a local municipality in London, where they were trying to design a service for people within the borough to access opportunities and access new jobs. This group at the bottom were the people designing that service. And as with most public services, when things are being designed, people go, yeah, this is going to be great. We're just going to design a service, and then everyone in the entire borough can use it, which is like 125,000 people or something. Like, it's a lot of people. And so we basically said to them, why don't we try and access the people who are the hardest, that you find the hardest to reach, and then we can kind of start with that and then work up and go bigger and bigger and bigger. Because if you've got them on board, then you can kind of start to scale it up. Whereas it's very difficult sometimes because, especially local government, they'll put out a call that they're designing some new service or a new product, and they get the same 5 people calling them up every time, being like, oh, amazing, yeah, let's get involved. And, you know, and these people they're very helpful because they're very enthusiastic, but they're the same people and the same typologies and the same personas always being interviewed. So basically, we worked with them to access a kind of, I don't know if anyone has read anything about like intersectionality. So the idea of people who are, it's basically, my understanding of it is that you're part of many, many different minority groups at the same time. So we basically tried to come up with some vague personas of intersectional people within that borough. So people from a minority ethnic background who also happen to be gay or who also happen to have some sort of disability. Like that as an example was that the thing that we were trying to design around, just to make sure that we were kind of working against our biases. So this was just like a bit of user testing we were doing, like with these guys at the top who, were kind of ticking. It sounds ridiculous, but we were kind of doing like a box ticking exercise, but trying to like tick every single box we could at the same time. And that meant that we could, then design with them and then kind of design broader after that. This is just kind of doing the same thing, but with people who had criminal convictions as well within that borough. So kind of taking it one step further to not only their, I guess kind of perceivable differences, but also things which were part of their kind of personality and part of their, not their personality, part of their interactions with different things. And then we just did some user testing with them. And then the third thing is basically the idea that exclusion increases your risk of failure, whereas inclusion reduces it. And this is just really, really important because I think all of this is basically anytime anyone is designing anything, there is an element of risk within it. And that's what's so wonderful about designers is that you're risking quite a lot in putting something out there. But the risk of that is sometimes that doesn't land. You know, sometimes that doesn't work. So building kind of inclusion and building diversity into your design process and into your research certainly we think reduces that. And you can do that. We just did a project recently with the police service in Northern Ireland. There's a lot of quite tense activity there and has been for the last like 30 or 40 years about religious tensions between Catholics and Protestants. This was something where the police service wanted to increase the diversity of people within the police force so that you could create generally a stronger institution that would then be able to look after the communities within where these tensions were rising. And so I guess in this particular thing, this particular circumstance, they came to us because they wanted to understand people's perceptions of the police in these areas so that they could create a kind of inclusive recruitment process, which would then lead to a system that was ultimately more inclusive because the people that were out there arresting people or looking after people could, relate to the people that they were looking after and the other way around. So that is what we did, and that is the end of my presentation. And thank you.
Thank you, James.
That's
That
all
was
right.
amazing.
Do I take this off now?
Yeah, you can just, it's done. Paul did it
Right.
over there. Thank you. Public services need all the help they can get, so wishing you all the best in your Portuguese operations. Now, last but not least, we have Farai Madzima. He works at Shopify. He's a UX lead at Shopify in Canada. He came to Lisbon to talk at the Lisbon LX UX conference. There's always a bit of a confusion. The name is very similar. That was very fish that you came after that to talk here. Fish. Muito fish. It means it was cool of you to then come and talk to us as well.
As in fish, the fish. As in the fish? Yeah. Okay.
Farai is originally from Zimbabwe, right? Then he lived and worked in South Africa. And now he's living, as I said, in Canada. So let's welcome him to the stage.
Cool?
Yeah.
Yeah, all good. Thanks very much for having me over. My first time in Portugal, first time in Lisbon, which is pretty cool. Thank you, Pipedrive, for hosting us, and UX Lisbon for inviting me to join. Thanks to the previous speakers. I think they did a great job of introducing and talking about this topic from very different perspectives, and it's interesting to see the work that's being done everywhere else. I will warn you that I get very excited about talking about this, and when I get very excited about talking about this, I speak very quickly. And so you have permission to tell me to slow down, right? You just put your hand up and be like, chill, bruh, and I'll slow down. But this is a thing that can happen. And I understand that English may not be the first language for everybody. So if I speak really, really fast, so I found this, I was in an Uber, and my driver was just talking really, really quickly, and I was like, I have no idea what you're saying. I know a few words, but when you speak that quickly, I can't get it. So please tell me to slow down if I go too quick, right? 2 years ago, there was a funeral for a gentleman called Hugh Masekela. He's a jazz musician. This happened in Johannesburg in South Africa. And at the funeral, people were singing and dancing. It didn't feel like a funeral. They were celebrating the life of this gentleman. He's kind of a hero to me, and I want to talk a bit about why that is the case. So Hugh grew up in, am I pressing the right button? I'm pressing, yeah. So Hugh grew up in South Africa, and growing up, he was a bit of a troublemaker, but one of his teachers figured out that he loved music, and so he found him a trumpet, and Hugh started playing in a jazz band at the school, and he fell in love with jazz. He wanted to know everything about it. He wanted to always be listening, tried to play what he was hearing on the radio. He wanted to know about the musicians, and he wanted to be like them. So he, at the time, the best jazz musicians of the time, they were probably in New York, people like Max Roach and Thelonious Monk. And so he was trying to figure out how can he get in touch with these people and hang out with them. One of the things that he did was find this movie called The Man with the Horn, which Kirk Douglas was in. And in it, Kirk Douglas plays a guy who's kind of playing the trumpet here, as you might see. But Kirk Douglas also got all the ladies. And so he was like, yes, I definitely want to be a trumpeter, and I want to get all the ladies. This is the kind of person that I want to be like growing up. Somehow, one of his teachers did manage to get in touch with an eminent jazz musician of the time, a man called Dizzy Gillespie. And they managed to write to Dizzy Gillespie. There was no Twitter, there was no internet. I don't know how they got his details, but nevertheless, they reached out to him. They told him, Dizzy, there's this guy who loves playing music. He's been trying to play the kind of things that you've been playing. And so what happened was Dizzy was, he was excited about this idea that there is this young teenager over in South Africa, in Johannesburg, who's playing jazz music. And he sent him his very own trumpet. And so this is Hugh receiving Dizzy Gillespie's trumpet, and he was very excited about it. Not only did he love jazz music, but it turned out that jazz music loved him back a bit, right? At the time, if you were listening to jazz, it may have sounded a bit like this. Oh, we got audio. That sound is swing. So that was the most popular form of jazz music at the time. It was the most popular form of music in most instances. If you were going out to a party, going out clubbing on a Friday night in New York, that's probably what you were listening to. It was played by a big band, and it was played live. But the challenge was that the artists were unhappy because they only were allowed to make the music that made money. Commercial artists end up in this situation, and they wanted to explore different avenues that may not have been commercially viable, but were interesting to them as artists. And so what they did in between sessions was they started to practice and started doing new things. So what's different between those two things, mostly, is that the first swing is kind of, you can dance to that, and it was made for that. It was made for partying. The second type of jazz, called bebop, was much faster, and it's got lots of complex chord changes and rhythms, and it's less about you having a good time dancing to the music, and it's more about the musicians exploring expression. And they would have solos where the trumpet player would do something, the bass player would do something, and all those different things. It was music for musicians. You had to have an educated ear to be able to appreciate it. And that's what it kind of transitioned into, right? And Hugh was hearing this from across in South Africa, and he was, in love with what was going on. So during his lifetime, so at the time he was in South Africa, there was apartheid. So apartheid meant that black people and white people couldn't live in the same areas. They couldn't have the same access to opportunities. In one instance, there was a curfew that was instituted, which meant that black people were not allowed to be seen in groups of 10 people or more at any one time, or you would all be arrested. Hugh was a jazz musician, so that meant that you couldn't perform in a group like this. And he wanted to build his career. He was also affiliated with the political party that was there at the time, which made him a target for the police. And so he ended up having to leave South Africa, and he went to the UK. And in the UK, he was in exile, and he wanted to pursue jazz music, to listen to it, and to learn more. But I don't know, James, if you can attest to this, but I don't know if there's much jazz going on in London and the UK in general. Yeah, right? So nevertheless, he couldn't kind of further his education. The thing that was happening is, can I move? Is that buzzing? Is that okay? It's cool. What happened was, a friend of his who was in New York at the time, his ex-girlfriend actually called him, and she said, listen, if you want to be at the middle of where jazz music is, you need to come over here to New York. And he was like, cool. She bought him a ticket. He flew over. On the day that he arrives in New York, Dizzy Gillespie somehow finds out that he was coming to New York. Dizzy Gillespie calls him up, and he's like, we're going clubbing tonight. Again, there was no Twitter, there was no Instagram, but somehow he figured it out. He called him, they got together, they went out clubbing that night. So Dizzy Gillespie is one of the main people in this jazz movement, calls Hugh, and in that night, they went to all the top jazz spots, stayed up all night. And Hugh Masekela was introduced to all of his music heroes, people like Thelonious Monk, people like Max Roach that he had only been hearing on the radio, people he was trying to be like. All of a sudden, he was in the middle of these people, meeting them, and maybe even got a chance to play with them all in that one night. This was an amazing thing. I can imagine that maybe if it was today, they'd be following each other on Twitter, on Instagram. Maybe he would have joined their Slack group or something like that. I don't know. But this was an amazing thing for him, coming from, from very far to being in the middle of what was going on. The big thing that you wanted to do as a jazz musician at that time was you wanted to join a band. You wanted to be in one of the bands like what I just showed you. And Hugh tried for all his life to try and get to play with one of these folks, and he was good enough. He managed to get some sessions with them. He was playing on some of their records, but he wasn't a permanent member of a group. And he kept trying to pursue this until he met this gentleman, Miles Davis, one of the coolest jazz cats to ever exist. And Miles Davis was like, Hugh, what's wrong with you? How is it possible that you've come from thousands of kilometers from across the world and you want to be just like us? Don't you recognize that where you come from and what you know is a source of heritage? Being on the outside is important. The perspective that you bring is critical. You know about rhythms and perspectives on music that we have never known and we could never learn. Why don't you think about that and put it together with the other things that are going on here, and we can make something transcendent. You can make something that moves jazz music forward. You can bring something that we can learn that's new, that we could never have known because of who you are, where you come from. Well, at least this is what Hugh Masekela heard. What Miles Davis actually said was, take your shit from home, put that with the shit you learn here, and that's gonna be a motherfucker, right? But this changed Hugh's life. He essentially changed his direction, and he understood that, what I know is something that these folks will never know without me showing them. And so he started revisiting the lullabies, the love songs, the war songs that would be sung in his native Africa where he was from. And he started combining those with the jazz techniques that he was learning in New York, and he created a new Afro-jazz fusion sound. And I think at his funeral, this is what they were celebrating. They were celebrating the idea that he managed to bring his own heritage, his own culture, his outside perspective to a new place and combine those things to create something new. And for me, this is why Hugh Masekela is a hero. Now, where you work, and we've heard some of this from the folks at Pipedrive, we talk a lot about diversity. We want to work with people who are not like us, who don't look like us, people with different perspectives than us, people who are differently abled than us, people with different beliefs. Why? So that we can extend the range of what we believe to be normal. Right now, what we believe to be normal is very narrow. The world is very broad. And we need to bring people with different perspectives to change how we think about the products that we make, the processes we use to make those products, the companies that we build, right? We want to change all that and expand it to include more and more people. And to do that, we need to be thinking differently, right? We need people who don't think like us. And this is fantastic. It's actually been proven by a gentleman called Scott Brick that when you have teams that are made up of diverse people, that team is more likely to come up with new and innovative ideas. That team is more resilient and more adaptive to change. This mathematical formula explains the wisdom of crowds, right? So what does it mean when I can make a guess about a certain situation versus when this whole group can make a guess about that situation? The likelihood is that the group will get it right more often than I will, just because of my own view. And that's what this mathematics kind of talks about. This different perspective, the meanings, attitudes, values, this comes from the culture that we live in, right? You don't just have a perspective by itself, but rather your perspectives comes from the culture that you grow in. This culture also has different practices. How do you celebrate? How do you have communication? All of these things will be different, right? And this is the thing that I think we forget when we talk about diversity and inclusion, is that we want to bring the different perspective, how you think. We want to see that in the work that you're doing, but we maybe think less about what kind of person you are when you are thinking differently. And how do we put those things together? Our assumption is if you've got a great portfolio and you are diverse, we're going to hire you, you're going to join the team, and everything's going to be fantastic with this team that's made up of different people, right? And I think this is where there's a bit of breakage. I think that we can afford to think about the challenges that come up when people from different cultures work together. I had an experience of this in my first job. I was in the UK. I was there for about 10 years. I was working on a project. I was leading the project for the first time in my life, having a direct relationship with the client. And the project wasn't working out, but I kept waiting for the right moment to talk to my boss and explain that, look, something is wrong. This thing isn't working. And for some reason, I couldn't have that direct conversation with him. And eventually the client calls my boss, tells him that, do you know that this project is going off the rails? My boss is like, no, I didn't know. He puts down the phone, he pulls me aside, he's like, what's going on? 3 days later, he calls me into the office and he's like, Farai, you didn't do enough. We're gonna have to let you go. I was 22 and I'd just been fired from my first job. I knew exactly what I'd done wrong. I knew what I needed to do, but somehow I couldn't have those conversations that I needed to have with my boss. A few weeks later, I was reading a Malcolm Gladwell book called Outliers. In it, he talks about Korean Airlines. And in Korean Airlines, they had a spate of crashes. What was happening was that, so between 1970-something and the 1990s, they lost about 700 lives. Absolutely crazy for an airline. That should not happen. Why was this happening? So they listened to the black box recordings. And what they hear is that the pilots can't talk to each other properly. In one particular instance, there was an airplane that was flying through a storm. And they couldn't see with their eyes, and they were relying on instruments. And as they're doing this thing, you can hear the co-pilot saying, oh, this storm is very bad. We can't really see, can we do something about this? The co-pilot was being very soft about what was going on. The pilot wasn't responding because of this soft conversation. And in the end, they crashed into the side of a mountain. When the investigators were listening to these tapes, they started to see this trend, and they were like, what's going on? It turns out that in Korea, they have what they call a high power distance index. What this means is that when someone is working with someone who is their boss, they see that person almost as godlike. And so their ability to have a direct conversation with that person is minimized. In some instances, that relationship was so bad that the co-pilot used to carry the pilot's bag to the airplane when they were going to fly. Not because it was his buddy and he was doing him a favor, but they weren't peers. Right? One was superior and one was definitely inferior. And so what this meant was that in the airplane, when the pilot was making a mistake, the co-pilot couldn't call the pilot out. When I thought this, I thought this sounded kind of familiar. I didn't want to make an excuse for my failure, for the fact that I had kind of been fired, but I started to understand that there are things about my culture that were showing up at work that I didn't know about. I wasn't thinking, I literally had no idea that there was something about where I grew up that can influence how I show up at work. And this is what I mean when I talk about culture appearing as a bias in the work that we do. we bring the diverse teams and we bring the diverse perspectives, but we also bring diverse cultures, which we might not be aware of, that can result in clashes that mean that as much as we've got brilliant people with great portfolios working together, we might not be able to actually work efficiently or effectively, and we might not deliver the product or the innovation that we expect to deliver. Geert Hofstede is a man who defined this thing called power distance index. He's a Dutch professor. And he defined, so the power distance index I spoke about, he defined that. He defined a bunch of other things, individualism, the tendency for nurturing or power seeking, uncertainty, long-term orientation. I looked at these things and I was like, oh, this is interesting and I can learn more about this in my culture, but it wasn't really helpful for my work. I couldn't understand how do I translate these into the work that I'm doing on a day-to-day basis, right? That's when I came across the work of Dr. Erin Mayam, and she's a principal at INSEAD Business School, which is just outside Paris. And she had her own scale similar to his. And she writes about it in this book called Culture Map, which y'all should get and y'all should read. But she talks then about, deciding, I've gone too far. She talks about these other things that you do. So deciding, persuading, communicating, disagreeing, evaluating, leading, trusting, scheduling. These are things that we do on a day-to-day basis at work. And she talks about how culture can influence how each of us do these different things based on the cultures that we grew up in, the cultures we were educated in, and the cultures that we ultimately end up working in or that our companies kind of form. So when it comes to deciding what might happen, so there are some cultures where there is what is called consensual decision-making. We must all agree so that we can move forward. And in other cultures, there is top-down decision-making. The boss decides, we have to get on with it, right? Neither of these is better or worse. I had an experience of this where I was working in South Africa, there was a day that we launched one of our products. We launched it on the tablet app. As soon as we launched this, the CEO announces, and we're also going to have the phone version up in 90 days. And the media obviously were happy about this, but the rest of us who were working on that team weren't, because we hadn't been consulted. And the first time we heard about that was on the TV, right? So what that meant was when we went back to work, we had to figure out how to land this app in 90 days. The top-down decision had been made. But what was difficult for us was not just that we had to do the design and engineering, we also had to convince everybody else in the company to get with the program, because they had also only heard about it at that time. If you contrast that with what they might do in Japan, which is called ringishi, where if a big decision like that is going to be made, lower level people will discuss the opportunity and say, can we do this in 90 days? They will then write a paper on this. That will go to middle management, to senior management. By the time the head boss says we're doing this thing, everyone in the company has heard about it. Everybody may not agree, but they know what we're committed to and what we want to do. So that on the day that they announce it and they want to go, everybody's there and everybody can get on with the work. And we just need to focus on design and engineering, not design engineering and also getting the organization together. So that's to say, consensual or top-down isn't wrong or right, but what's important to understand is, what do we as a team, what do we as a company value? How are we going to make a decision? When everybody knows that, then there's less opportunity for conflict in getting what we need to get done, right? So agree on how you want to make that decision as a team. I was going to talk about persuading, but that's a bit boring. These slides can be made available and you can share them out and you can have a look at them. But I want to get on to, because I realize that I've only got like 3 minutes left. So when it comes to communicating, there is what is called low context cultures and there are what are called high context cultures. What does this mean? I'll give you an example. So when I was, I grew up in Zimbabwe till I was 18. I left for about 7 years. And when I came back to South Africa, or when I went back to Zimbabwe, I went to visit one of my uncles, and a friend of mine gave me a lift and dropped me off there. It was cool, I arrived. When I get there, my uncle asks me in Shona, which is my native language, he says, "Wawuya wega," which means, did you come here by yourself? And I was like, no, my friend dropped me off, and so, that's how I got here. And my uncle's like, "Wawuya wega." He emphasizes it some more. And I'm like, I just told you, I got a lift. That's how I got here, someone dropped me off. Then he asks me a third time, "Wawuya wega." So I'm now confused, and I look to my aunt, and I'm like, yo, can you translate? I haven't forgotten the language or anything. I still know what's going on. What is he saying? And my aunt says to me, what your uncle means is, did you bring a wife? I'm like, the fuck? How did we even get to that point, right? So what my uncle was doing was using high context communication. What he was saying was, we are both from the same culture. You left here when you were a child. You now have a job. You're of marrying age, you have a beard. We expect you to bring back, a wife. We expect you to be married. And you should know this if I say, "Wawuya wega," did you come here by yourself? right? That's an example of high context communication, where there is an assumption that you know what's going on, and I just have to say a few things, and that should trigger off a whole essay, whole paragraphs that weren't being said that you should have understood. Contrast that with low context communication, where we assume that between us we know nothing. If you go to training to give presentations, you might hear somebody say something like, okay, here's how you give a good presentation. First of all, tell the people what you're about to tell them. Introduce the presentation. Then you give the actual presentation, right? When you're finished, remind everybody what you just told them. Repetition. Repetition is great in low context. Why is that important? Because we can make no mistakes. No one will be confused about what happened. So when we work in cross-cultural teams, low context is the recommendation, because it means that everybody knows what's going on. If you just were on a Zoom call and you had a conversation about a thing, somebody needs to write an email, summarize exactly what we discussed, and make sure that's written out so that everybody is clear on what happened, right? And those are the differences and the things we might accommodate for when we're trying to communicate across cultures. When it comes to disagreeing, there are cultures where confrontation is okay, and we can have those conversations, and other cultures where we might avoid confrontation. An example is I have someone who I used to work with came from Burundi. They joined an engineering team in North America, and during one of their one-on-ones with their lead said, listen, your code is great, but I hate the fact that you always say yes to everything I ask you to do. And so she's like, okay, hold up. My code is great. I said yes to the things you want me to do. What the problem is, right? And ultimately what the boss was saying was, the best way for you to bring your perspective to this organization is to question the things that we ask you to do. Not because you want to be stubborn, but because you bring a new perspective. And when you question what we are asking you to do, you cause us to reflect on what we want to do, right? And so that confrontation, that conversation is going to help us to, at the very least, take advantage of your perspective and try and build a better product, build a better team. What she was thinking was, coming from a culture that avoids confrontation, she was thinking, if I question my boss, I'm going to lose my job, right? So the cultures were very different there. So what the lead then did was to create a situation where they could role play. They could pretend to have these confrontational conversations until she started to understand that you can have a confrontation without it resulting in a breakdown in the relationship. You can have a confrontation and keep your job, right? And that's a good thing. In German, they have this word called Sachlichkeit, which means that we can argue the thing about the thing without arguing people. We can have a very loud conversation about something that we don't agree about, and we can walk out of that conversation as friends because we talk about the thing, not about each other. Whereas if you're doing this in North America, there's a strong likelihood that if you argue with somebody about something that they've done, they will walk away thinking that it's a personal conversation, and you're saying that they're a bad person or they're a bad designer, right? So the important thing is to be able to understand, how do we have objective conversations across cultures? When it comes to giving feedback, there are cultures where direct negative feedback is great, and others where you don't want to give direct negative feedback because it will break group harmony. So imagine that you've got a team in Nigeria working with a team in the UK. The UK team presents to the Nigerians. The Nigerians are looking at the work, remote call on Zoom, they put up the Envision prototype, and the Nigerians are like, this is absolutely the wrong thing, right? You entirely missed the brief, and there is no way that we're going to ship this product with those kinds of interactions that you're going to design. So please review these things. Let's talk again on Friday and see if we're going to ship it to the client, right? The UK people are going to be like, whoa, what did we just do? Is this personal, right? Those people are douches. We don't want to work with them again, right? And they may not even tell the Nigerians directly that they're unhappy with that. Let's flip that around. Let's have the Nigerians presenting to the British. The British might be like, thanks very much, folks. It looks like we're getting there. It looks like we're getting really, really close. Just a few things that you might want to think about, and we're going to describe those things, and you might want to have a look at some of those interactions on that login form. They might need a bit of tweaking if you have some time, but otherwise, thanks very much for your efforts, it's looking good. And the Nigerians will get off the call and they'll be like, we killed it, right? Everybody's equally unhappy, but they're very different interpretations of that feedback, right? And so being able to be direct or indirect is something that we have to normalize. We have to understand, what are the different cultures, where they're coming from, right? So what you need to do is to skill up on the critique method that you want your team to use, because critique is a skill. It is not an innate thing. Just because I can design a new sketch doesn't mean I can talk about design effectively. Skill up. put everybody on a level. It's not just a design skill. Everyone in the organization needs to feedback. Whether it's a code review, we're reviewing a product brief, we all want to be able to be better at doing this thing, right? At Shopify, when I started joining, when you onboard in your first days, they literally skill you up on either radical candor or discussing design. You learn about how to talk about this thing, because what they say is you're not just here to make the product, you're also here to improve the company, which means that you need to be able to critique everything that we are doing, and we need to be able to discuss those things in a productive way. Leading, I spoke about a little bit, right? So leading is the challenge that I faced when I was in the UK, where my relationship with the people who were leading me, I expected deep hierarchy. That's what I knew from my culture. When I was working there, my boss would crash on my sofa after a night out, and it was very flat, and it was alien to me. And so my natural instinct was to recreate the hierarchy in my own mind, even though the organization was flat. In my culture, my expectation was that we needed to have this level, and I was creating false barriers between us. What was important is for us to maybe normalize and have a conversation about, listen, we have a flat structure here, and the reason why we value flat structure is this. If you have any challenges with that, we can discuss that. Conversely, if you work in an organization that has deep hierarchy, there might be a very good reason for that. And so we should discuss, why do we have all these levels of management? And how do we work with all those levels of management, right? As long as everyone in the group has understood why things work and how things work, we can avoid the clashes that can happen across these different cultures. When it comes to building trust, there are two kinds of ways of building trust. There's task-based trust. What this means is, if you're great at your job, and you'll find this mostly in North America, if you're great at your job, we trust you because you're great at your job. That's all we need from you. You go over to the East, in places like China, we trust each other because we have a relationship, because we spend time together. I know about your family, you know about my family. That's why I trust you, right? You might be good at your job, but that doesn't mean that I'm going to do a deal with you, right? And so it's understanding, how do we build this trust? Dr. Erin Meyer here suggests, importantly, that breaking bread, eating together, is a way across cultures to kind of build, right? And this is important because it doesn't mean we're going out for drinks after work, because drinks are actually not very inclusive. If you think about people who are parents, people who are previous alcoholics, all of those different things, they don't want to go to drinks, right? Have a team breakfast, have a team lunch, right? Sit with the team and eat together, and that's a great way to build trust across all those different cultures, right? When it comes to scheduling, when it comes to scheduling, there are different approaches here. There's linear time, where cultures like German culture, they have a plan. We must follow the plan from beginning to end. We don't deviate, right? And this is great because it means that the team can be predictable. If the project was supposed to ship in September, resources are available from then on, and we can work on the next thing. We need to do this so we can plan forward. That's great. However, in other cultures, they value being flexible. Yes, we've got a plan, but if a new opportunity comes up, you'll see this a lot in India and in China. If something new comes up, we might want to explore that, because that might be the next big thing, and we might want to divert our resources entirely so we can do this new thing, because that's what's going to get us ahead. Again, it is not about whether one is better than the other, but it's about knowing that these different opportunities exist and deciding as a team what's important to us. Is it important to us for us to always start and finish the plan as we planned, or is it important to us to be flexible and to be able to change and switch between those things? So these are the 8 things that I had learned about from Erin Meyer, and they really helped me to think about, okay, so my culture, where I'm from, how can I think about how I can bring that to work to bear? Diversity is an important thing. Yes, we need people who are different shades of brown. We need to include folks who have different religious, gender, or able, and all these other differences. We must make sure that we are working with those people. We must include them in the work that we are doing to increase our value, our understanding of what normal is, right? But if you think that's all that is, then you might be making a mistake. You will see many team photos that all of a sudden have the token person, the one of a kind in them. That's optics. It looks great. It doesn't necessarily mean that we are actually changing what we are doing or how we are doing it, right? We have to find a situation where people can be included and they can feel as though they are part of what we are doing, and they're able to lead and make decisions in our organizations, even if they're different than us, right? We can afford to learn from Hugh and Miles. We can afford to be more like Miles, who, when he saw somebody who was different, who was forgetting their own difference, he pointed that out and he said, yo, think about where you're from and how you are, and can you bring some of that to our organization so that we can benefit? Can you bring that to our team, to our product, so that we can make something better? Because culture hides more than it reveals. And strangely enough, what it hides most effectively from its own participants. Like me, I didn't know that high power distance index was the thing that affected me. It's like the air, it's around me. I don't know that it's there. I'm just breathing it, it's a part of my life, right? Culture does the same thing. We don't know that we are doing things because of culture. We just are who we are. Sometimes it needs to be pointed out to us. We can also afford to be like Hugh, who, when he was told, he understood that he needed to look back to where he was from and to harness his perspective, to harness being an outsider, and to bring that to bear in the work that he was doing at that time. When we do this, when we know our shit, and we put that with the shit that we learn wherever we go, that's gonna be a motherfucker. Please.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Farai. Wow. We have a lot to think about. And we'll do that processing while we eat a little bit and drink something. And we can network as well. So we're going to break for a few minutes. And when you come back, and we want you all to come back, I'm going to have a Q&A moment where everyone can participate, where everyone can say whatever they want. Thank you.